Today's video, we're heading down south, very south, to the lands of Far Harad in Middle-earth. I'll show you how I painted a sun-kissed half-troll and a Mahud warrior, and by the end I'll do a little showcase of the army so you can see how it's shaping up so far. The half-troll was undercoated with a spray of army paint uniform grey, because when painting on lighter colours afterwards it's a bit easier, but also I can see the definition in the sculpts from the get-go. However, for the Mahud warrior, I went with Ossified Earth by Colourforge, because there's going to be more beige colours going on for him. Now, I wanted to do a sun-kissed reddish looking troll rather than the standard grey that Games Workshop's done. I mean, I've already got grey trolls for my Minds of Mario army, so I wanted something a smidge different. I wanted these trolls to look like they've spent their entire lives baking under the Far Harad sun. Using a soft bristled makeup brush, please don't judge me, an initial base coat of Banshee Brown was added, and this was followed up with 2 lighter layers of carnelian skin and camo brown, thus bringing up the browner tanned colours. One of the reasons I love using these big soft brushes is how ridiculously quick they are compared to layering with a normal brush. Using Hearthborn, I gradually went lighter and focused more of my efforts on the stomach, the inside thigh and facial areas. In my head, these would be the softer skinned areas and would look quite nice as well when viewing the mini from the front. Afterwards, to tie them all in together, I applied a thin layer of orange tone mixed with a bit of medium. It smooths those transitions, adds lovely warmth, and stops the skin from looking dusty or chalky. And to be fair, this was a pretty quick stage, around about 5 minutes to get to this point. You gotta love a makeup brush, but don't tell the missus that you've nicked it. As soon as I finished with all the initial colours, I wanted to bring the depth of the troll out a bit more, because of the muscles and nice derpy features in his face. So I went in with some purple tone and used a miniature brush. And yes, before anyone says anything, I know this brush looks like it survived the Battle of Pelennor Fields. However, old brushes are brilliant for washers, bases, or generally abusing. Not every brush gets to retire with dignity. To further enhance and deepen some of the shadows, I slapped on, yes that's a technical term, some dark tone. Mainly near the spine and the knees, but also quite a bit on the feet, just to tint the colour of the skin, but make those feet dark and dingy. Oh, and before I forget, a little tip here. And I do this all the time because I'm too impatient to thoroughly shake my paints, so you might end up with shiny areas like so. To fix that, I simply brush on a little mecha matte varnish from Vallejo. It's a product designed for the airbrush, however I ignore that completely, and use it straight on with a brush. And it works brilliantly. So we've got to a point with the skin where it's good enough for the tabletop, and we could move on to the details. However, I did end up adding a bit more to the skin, just because of how quick the process has been so far. And because he's not really wearing much clothing, I spent a bit more time on the skin for Freddy here. Using a fine detail brush, I added some mouldy wine, which is like a nice plum colour. And I painted some highlights on the hands and the face, but also painted some thin streaks along some of the larger muscles that he's got going on. Nothing too dramatic, just enough to suggest a little texture in the skin. Lastly, for the skin, I switched to Hearthborn again for the brightest highlights. Now, compared to the previous colour, it's noticeably lighter, so I kept these highlights nice and small, just working on the more prominent areas like the knuckles, brow, nose, and a few of those muscles. I also leaned in towards the areas which I painted lines for the mouldy wine stage, but this time added thinner, smaller lines with the detail brush. And after painting in the eyes, we stared at each other for a little bit, and I knew that we had an instant connection which would last a lifetime. Lloyd here didn't want to be left out. Unlike the troll, I went a completely different approach for the skin and reached straight for the speed paints. Warrior skin was mixed with a little speed paint medium to take the edge off the colour before being painted over all of the flesh. This was followed by a strong skin wash from the Fnatic range for all of the shading. And don't trouble yourself being neat here. If the paint goes on something else, then so be it. You're gonna paint over it anyway. One thing worth mentioning, this miniature being cast in metal rather than a nice smooth succulent plastic, you'll find that speed paints and washes both manage to find all those little impurities in the surface and start to gather up where you don't want to. A thin layer of leather brown was chosen to not only cover up these, but to give a final result of the skin in a more deserty, tanned feel, rather than looking like one of those pale Gondorians that has never left Minas Tirith. In terms of highlights, I didn't do too much, just mainly picking out the facial features, hands, elbows, knees and toes, and I used Paratrooper Tan for that. With these models, as you will see in the end, it will all be about the leopard print and the white markings, which will make them stand out on the tabletop. One of the things I absolutely love about these Mahud are the tribal markings. They instantly tell a story, and they're not just pristine looking soldiers, like those tinny Gondorians up north. But I see these more like hunters and warriors, and I painted these markings using worn stone. I deliberately avoided pure white as I thought it would be far too stark looking. This warmer off-white looks much more natural against the tanned skin. Fun fact, I looked at tribal markings and tattoos on Pinterest for inspiration. I tried not to duplicate too much throughout the army. Back to the half troll. Now we're going to start painting in the details, and first up is the neck armour decoration. I think it looks like a woven wicker, similar to the texture on the Mahud warrior's shield. So both of these areas will be painted in the same way. A desert yellow for the base coat, followed by a wash of strong skin shade. Let the wash paint do all the work for you and sink into the nooks and crannies to bring out the detail of that texture. Once the paint was completely dry, and not before unless you like a slushy blended mess, I then went on to highlight everything with amber skin. A fine tip detail brush for this one folks, and take your time. If you get any into the shaded areas, just rework some of that strong skin shade back in. And for the blowpipe weapon on the Mahud warrior, it was pretty similar. Desert yellow for the base coat, but this time light tone for the shade. This was placed more towards where the nubs of the bamboo, if it is bamboo, to tint the colour of those areas a bit. Whilst the strong skin tone was applied only into the deeper recesses, where it would hold the paint more. Now, with the blowpipes being synonymous with Mahud warriors, I wanted to spend just a little more time on them. So next I added some tiny little lines of amber skin to create striations near the nub sections, basically where the light tone was placed before, but making sure that that tinted colour can still be seen underneath. Finally, I thinned the same paint right down to almost a wash consistency, and glazed the centre of each section, brightening them up. Sticking with Lloyd for now, I turned my attention to the shield on his back. The wicker section has already been painted using the same colours as the troll's neck decoration, so all that was left was to do the wooden rim around the outside. For that, I used Banshee Brown as a base coat, before highlighting it with Obsidian Skin. I wasn't really after a rich, polished wood look here. These warriors live under relentless desert sun, so I imagine the timber would have been sun-bleached, dried out and weathered over time, rather than freshly chopped from Fangorn Forest. Yeah, Treebeard, I went there. And now for the second neck detail. I'm not 100% sure what it's supposed to be. Some kind of tribal armour, ceremonial neck guard, or perhaps it's just the latest Harad fashion. Like, dude, have you seen what 𝐒𝐿's wearing this season? Whatever it is, I wanted it to stand apart from the wicker. So I based it with Dungeon Grey before applying a dark tone over the whole thing. Once that had dried, I carefully picked out each individual strand with uniform grey. Originally, I planned on painting the vertical stripes the same colour, but it all started blending together a little too much. So I switched over to Camo Brown from the Army Painter historical range instead. It's a lovely terracotta brown, and with a dash of topaz skin for the highlight, our derpy troll is starting to look pretty. Next up, the cloth on both miniatures. I wanted to paint them in a way that would tie the force together, so I kept the colours consistent between the Mahud warriors and the half trolls. I originally tried a lighter green here, hated it, so I went back and chose Tundra Taupe instead, because I wanted something that felt more dusty looking rather than vibrant. I also went down a different route for shading and used Speed Paint Burnt Moss, with a bit of Speed Paint Medium. This was mainly to alter the colour to what I had envisioned. If you don't happen to own Burnt Moss though, don't worry. A military shade from the Fnatic range would still give a really nice result. Once that had dried, I reapplied some of the base coat onto the raised folds of the cloth, to bring back some of that original colour. Afterwards, I went in with a finer tipped brush and created some of those thinner highlights using Dusty Skull. I mixed clean lines with the little broken marks to give the cloth a slight raggedy feel to it. And for Lloyd, I went one further. Using a manky, tired looking brush that's ready to set sail west to 𝘊𝘪𝘮𝑗, I pattered on some patches of oak brown towards the bottom end of the cloth, just to give it that worn appearance, like it's been picking up dirt and muck whilst they've been walking. The half-troll has lots of decorative bones scattered on the sculpt, so I wanted to make a bit more of a feature with these and spend a little bit more time on them. Especially as they are going to be brighter than the cloth and the skin colours, so the eye would naturally go to these. I also picked out the teeth and nails at this point too. A mocha skin as the base coat, followed by soft tone as an all-over wash. I tend to swap between soft tone and light tone whenever I'm painting bones. Both methods give a slightly different tint to the overall look. So give it a go next time you're painting bones or skeletons, and I'm sure that you'll appreciate the results. Once everything was properly dry, I layered on skeleton bone, thinning it slightly with water and leaving the darker colours showing through in the recesses. That way it will create a natural transition between the darker and lighter areas. If this was a character, I would add a brighter, thinner highlight of bony spikes at this stage. But I've got another 5 half-trolls, or does that count as 2.5? Waiting patiently on the shelf to be completed. However, I will in fact add some brown into the deepest recesses to strengthen those shadows. With the main areas now complete, I just needed to finish off the strapping and the club. And I used a couple of different browns for this, making sure it looked different to the skin and the neck piece, as well as the lighter bone colours we've just painted, like you can see on the strapping here on the back of the arm. I also painted the leg wrappings black with grey highlights, just to break up all of those warmer tones that we've got going on. The same treatment worked nicely on the bindings around the weapon also. If you want the exact paint recipes that I've used for this section, or in fact pretty much the whole model, then let me know in the comments, as it's always good to get feedback from you guys, as I always appreciate you and the time you put in to watch these videos that I make. Now Lloyd, being the resourceful gentleman that he is, clearly wasn't content carrying around a simple bone weapon. No. He's gone and acquired himself what I imagine is some sort of volcanic stone blade. I pictured it being kind of like a dark green / black onyx. Something capable of splintering into nasty sharp fragments on impact. Which somehow feels perfectly fitting for a culture already known for their poison darts. Those naughty little scamps. To add a splash of colour across the army, I painted the decorative feathers in a few different colours. For this chap, I chose yellow. Mainly because I realised I hardly ever use yellow on Middle-earth miniatures. The poor thing just sits in the paint rack wondering what it's done wrong. Alright, Hobby Fellowship, this brings me to my question of the day. What paints in your collection almost never get used? Go on, we've all got one. To complete the Mahud tribal look, I went for a leopard print pattern on the remaining cloth. Now, I've already done a dedicated tutorial on that technique, and I'll link that one here down in the description, because this video is already getting pretty long. And with that, here is what the army looks like so far. There's half-trolls, plenty of Mahud warriors, some raiders. The camels were super fun to paint, by the way. Honestly, it's one of those armies that I've really wanted for a long time, and I'm happy that I've finally managed to do them justice. Now the elephant in the room, did you see what I did there? Do I get a mumma kill? And would you like to see that as a full painting tutorial? As always everyone, happy hobbying, and I'll see you in the next one.